Hey everybody, let me get myself on screen there. All right. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Peace and Liberty podcast. This is truly an episode you won't want to miss. But first, let me just mention that me and many others left Patreon recently, and we're waiting on Dave Rubin and Jordan Peterson to announce their new platform. But I do have an Amazon wish list that lets anybody out there listening buy me a book, which by all means, that would be a wonderful gift, and I'll happily give you a shout out on the show. Now, I'll warn you, this episode is going to be based in religion, and I don't know if you know this, but I'm personally Christian myself. It's been a journey of mine for many years. So today, me and my guests will be completely dismantling the notion that Jesus was a socialist. Now, we hear this all the time, ironically, by people who often aren't even religious. They just love to rub it in our face that and quote verses out of context and say things like, well, Jesus said to help the poor, so obviously he was against capitalism, right? And of course, the fact that 96% of extreme poverty in the world has been eliminated since 1820, that's obviously no result of capitalism, right? So we'll get into that. Without further ado, I'm happy to introduce my good friend Stephen Rose. He's the creator of the Facebook page Anarcho-Christian. You may have seen or heard about the page, and I've been a fan ever since it launched in 2017. Stephen has his own podcast he launched last year, and I was thrilled to be on episode 15, where we discussed Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State. So I'll link to that. I'm also going to be linking to the anarchochristian.com, his main website. I'm going to link to the Facebook page. It's nearly at 13,000 likes. That's incredible. I'm also going to link to the Facebook page, or excuse me, the Facebook group, which has been such a big help to me because, like I said, religion, at least for me, it wasn't at all obvious what the answers were, and we're all trying to find the truth here. So, Stephen, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've been talking about this. We've been wanting to do this episode since sometime last year, and we've both had to cancel at least 2 or 3 times. Life happens. But I think a good way to preface our discussion, which is about whether Jesus was a socialist or not, hint he wasn't. Me and you are both anarchists and Christians, which some seem to think is contradicting. How can you simultaneously be against rulers on principle while also viewing God as our ultimate ruler, so to speak? How do you tackle that question?
So that is a very common question. And the way that I like to illustrate that is that government between man and man is a horizontal relationship, and the relationship between man and God is a vertical relationship. So when we do talk about anarchism and all these different forms of government that we could possibly have, and we're always trying to find the perfect government or the perfect way that it's going to work without a state, all of those discussions are on that horizontal relationship.
Yeah, that's how I've always thought about it. I mean, I think your subtitle for Anarcho-Christian is No King But Christ. So yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. So let's see here. What do we got down here for the first question? Well, for our viewers watching, Stephen is very knowledgeable related to putting things in the context. I read the Bible as much as I can, but like I said, I was a latecomer to Christianity. So I'm going to let him do a fair bit of the talking, but I think we agreed to do part of the discussion on this little book I have right here. Pull it out. It's titled Rendering Unto Caesar, Was Jesus a Socialist by Lawrence Reed. If you don't know Reed, he's the current president of the Foundation for Economic Education. And I'm going to link to a free PDF version of in the show notes. Now, he goes over many points here. I probably have 6 or 7 listed that are the most important. So he starts off the book like this. First page here. On June 16th, 1992, London's Daily Telegraph reported this astonishingly bold remark by former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Jesus was the first socialist, the first to seek a better life for mankind. So, I mean, coming from Gorbachev, that's obviously pretty hilarious. I mean, if you're listening to Yuri Maltsev, he has a lot of things to say about Gorbachev, none of them too nice. But what do you think about that? I mean, we hear this all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I have my copy here as well, and just trying to stay with you here. And he does cut him a little bit of slack, considering that the Soviet Union was largely an atheistic movement. He's not really going to be well learned on Jesus and who Jesus is and the Gospels and everything like that. And then directly after that, he says, let's define the term socialism. And I think that that's the biggest part of the conversation, kind of the biggest piece to work from, because what is Gorbachev referring to? And he says that, what is anyone that would say that today if they're coming from, whatever position they're coming from. What do they mean by the term socialism? And even though I think that you're going to get a lot of different opinions on that, the way that he describes it here in the book, I think is very accurate, and it is the proper starting point from that statement. And so if I could just read a couple of sentences from that. He says, let's first define the term socialism, and skip it down a little bit. Isn't voluntary like the Girl Scouts. Its stick is the concentration of power to forcibly achieve one or more, or usually all, of these purposes: central planning of the economy, government ownership of property, and the redistribution of wealth. No amount of, quote, we do it all for you, end quote, or, quote, it's for your own good, end quote, or, quote, we're helping other people, rhetoric can erase that. So what makes socialism socialism is the fact that you can't opt out of it.
Right. And I think especially young people who are just getting into ideology in general, they would define socialism as everyone's just sharing everything. But it's exactly the opposite when put into practice, that you have to be forced to share everything. In fact, I don't think many people know this. Marx, he was Jewish by ethnicity, but he was very atheistic. He thought religion needed to be destroyed. That was one of the main aspects of his kind of Marxism, that it needed to be destroyed. When Lenin came into power, Yuri Maltsev talks about this a lot, but Lenin essentially knew that you had to crush people that were religious. I remember in one occasion, Yuri was talking about how Lenin was sent a telegram, and the telegram was basically asking, Lenin, what do I do about all these religious people? And Lenin basically says, imbecile, kill them all. And kill everybody within a 150-mile radius so they squirm. I mean, that was basically the way he put it. So they had to crush religion because if you think about it, you can't have a god if you're going to have a dear leader, say like Kim Jong-un or whoever, Joseph Stalin, like they have to be the god. So you can't have a god in the midst of that. Right.
Which was, from Christianity's earliest, point, that was an issue with Rome, and Caesar being, this deity sort of figure, and having that no king but Christ, having that king, well, that is a conflict with the earthly rulers that also want to be seen like that.
Oh, we're going to get into Caesar. All right. But let's see here. So next question, we're going to go to, all right. So the first example he goes into is exactly that. So rendering unto Caesar. Many are familiar with that term. That's found in Matthew 25:17 through 22. And it's also mentioned in Mark 12:13 through 17. So how do we deal with that? Because I think the way Reed describes it, he says, quote, but notice that everything depends on just what truly did belong to Caesar and what didn't, which is actually a powerful endorsement of property rights. So I don't know if you have the verse right in front of you. If not, I can pull it out real quick.
I do. So I've got it. In the book of Mark, it's chapter 12, 17, the whole exchange is. And so, I mean, I can read through it's a small portion where it says, then they sent some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to him to trap him being Jesus, by what he said. When they came, they said to him, teacher, we know you are truthful and defer to no one. You don't show partiality, but teach truthfully the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay or should we not pay? But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius to look at. So they brought one, and he asked, whose image and inscription is this? He asked them. Caesar's, they said. Then Jesus told them, give back to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God's. And they were amazed at him. And so that is all of the passage that concerns that, the one verse, render unto Caesar.
And I guess taken out of context, it can be taken to mean, well, rendering unto Caesar. I mean, Jesus said it himself, but what Jesus is really getting at there is render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And what does that exactly mean? I mean, maybe Jesus actually meant Caesar deserves nothing, but you have to put it in the context. So how would you put it into context?
So the way that I try to put it into context, and you're right, there's really two different ways that this is looked at, from I guess a political standpoint.
Right.
There's the left and the right. I don't like using those terms all the time, but I think they get the point across that
right.
left and the more socialist, ideological, values, that they look at it as an endorsement of socialism. And then you have the right, more nationalistic side, which is then used to just, shut down the conversation on really how far we should push back against the government. In the correct way of looking at this verse, and I want to say two major opinions about it. One being that when he asked, whose image and inscription is this? And the answer is Caesar's. Well, he's saying that this is Caesar's, but he's making a bigger point, and I have it marked here also in rendering unto Caesar that Lawrence Reed makes. And he says, Jesus said nothing like it belongs to Caesar if Caesar simply says it does, no matter how much he wants, how he gets it, or how he chooses to spend it. And then Reed makes a good comment a little bit later in the book, which this is really the way that I feel that Jesus's remark, and the reason why they're amazed at it, is Reed says that Jesus was attempting to set the people's sights on what he regarded as higher things of greater immediate importance. And I really think that that's the greatest takeaway from this portion. He's saying that this coin with Caesar's face on it and Caesar's name on it, it's not important. The things that are God's being rendered to God, that's the important part. But if I may, one more thing, like I said, there's kind of two different opinions on this within the anti-state Christian perspective, and the other one is that the trick answer, or the trick question that Jesus is posing is that nothing belongs to Caesar, and I like this answer as well. I think that both of these answers, they're a little bit nuanced, but both of us kind of get us both of them get us to the same point. But there are many verses in the Bible that say that everything belongs to God. Psalm 50 is a big one. Leviticus and Exodus both have verses where everything belongs to God. So when Jesus says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, nothing is Caesar's, everything belongs to God. So like I said, it's nuanced, but those are your two, most popular ways of reading that verse.
I definitely agree with you. It's just, I guess the way it's read by some people and taken out of context, it can be easily taken for whatever people want it to mean. If they want to bash Christians, then they can just use it to mean that. And I just want to clarify that I made the mistake. I said Matthew 20 something earlier. The verse was Matthew, where was it here? Oh, geez. Sorry about that. Where am I going here? Sorry, what was that actual verse? I'm going crazy here.
Mark 12.
Right. Okay, that's the one. Sorry, I said the wrong verse earlier, so I apologize for that.
No problem. It's found in a couple of different the Gospels.
Exactly.
And I just had Mark pulled up here.
There you go. All right, so that's rendering unto Caesar. That's been crushed. Let's see. So the next would be upholding the law, and we find this in Matthew 5, 17 through 20, and Luke 24, 44. Now, I guess this one goes into, and I'll just quote the book here. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And in Luke 24, 44, he clarifies this when he says, everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here. This kind of goes back to the idea that there's a difference between the laws in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so, correct me if I'm wrong. I may be way off base at that point.
So there are a few different times in the Bible where you see God making the Mosaic law and these different covenants within the Bible, and they change throughout these different covenants. And so the big argument here is really, when we say law, what are we referring to? Are we referring to Caesar's law? Are we referring to, you know, all law that you happen to be under at the moment, no matter what? Or are we talking about God's law? And I think that you just read it out, but Reed, you know, hits the nail on the head, you know, when he says, but didn't Jesus say he came to uphold the law? What is he talking about? And Reed says that he clarifies in Luke 24:44 that everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms.
And that's speaking of Mosaic law. Like, for example, some people say, oh, well, you're Christian, you know, you can't eat seafood. Now, you explained this to me really beautifully, and I forget the exact way you phrased it, but it was kind of similar to that we're not bound by the same laws as they were in the Mosaic law. Can you explain that the best you can?
Yeah, a lot of the laws are ceremonial laws. And the ceremonial laws are what we've seen go away now that we are in the new covenant with Christ. And so that's usually what people are pointing back to, are the, you know, shellfish laws and things like that.
Right.
And those are the things that have largely been done away with, because once you have a good understanding of what all of those laws were representing and what they're pointing to, they're all pointing to Christ, and Christ fulfilled the laws. So these ceremonial laws were no longer obligated to hold. And we see that play out in the book of Acts, where Peter has a dream, and it's explained to him that the things that God made are no longer to be separated. So we had a lot of separation of God's people from the rest of the world in so many different ways in the Old Testament. And so when we have Christ fulfilling that, we're no longer held to those things that were a shadow pointing us to Christ.
Now, I guess for people who practice Judaism, who are Jewish, they're bound by only the Old Testament, and they don't believe in the New Testament. I guess for them, are they bound by the same laws that are in the Old Testament?
Yes, I think to varying degrees, you will have people, you know, taking on those aspects of the law.
Because I thought I heard Ben Shapiro say that he was asked, you know, do you eat seafood? And he's like, no, of course not. Like, right. I can't do that.
Right. And he holds to what's been traditional with the Old Testament, because he doesn't look at, you know, the New Testament and the new covenant that we have with Christ as being legitimate.
Gotcha. Well, that's another topic. So let's see. So he goes on to redistribution. Now, obviously, this is a big aspect, and this really hits on where we're trying to go here. Now, the 10th commandment of the 10 commandments is, thou shalt not covet, meaning you shouldn't covet, or you shouldn't desire the other things your neighbors have. And Reed goes into Luke 12:13-15. Jesus is confronted with a redistribution request. A man with a grievance approaches him and demands, quote, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replies thusly, "Man who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Like, aha, got us. You know, we can't have an abundance of possessions. How do you tackle that?
You know, I try to stick with the voluntary aspect of, you know, we have a lot of titles. Some of them I think are synonymous with, you know, anarcho-capitalism and voluntarism. So I try to, whenever I'm talking about it, stick with this voluntary aspect, and then also going back to what means, you know, essentially, and then redistributing the money or the goods or whatever it is that we're talking about, and pointing out in the New Testament all of these instances where people are voluntarily giving of their own.
And I would imagine from some aspect, then, if it's true that you're not supposed to covet your neighbor, it doesn't matter how much they have. I mean, you're not even supposed to be thinking about that. Like, oh, you know, he has one too many books, or he has one too many houses, or whatever. Like, if you don't covet what your neighbor has, then you're not even thinking about what he has. So, yeah, I guess that would be one way to explain it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really is that simple. And it does get back to these things, you know, with the 10 commandments of not coveting and not stealing.
Right. We'll have a few more aspects to go over here. The Good Samaritan law. So what about the story of the Good Samaritan? Doesn't that make a case for government welfare? And Reed says no. So in Luke 10, verses 29-37, A traveler comes upon a man at the side of the road. The man has been beaten and robbed and left half dead. What did the traveler do? He helped the man himself on the spot with his own resources. He did not say, quote, write a letter to the emperor or go see your social worker and walk on. So to be a good Samaritan means to do things voluntarily, to do the right thing. And it is the right thing to help people, but it has to be voluntary or else you're being coerced to do it, into doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just keep, hammering on the term voluntary. And with all of these, illustrations that we see, parables that we see, all of these things, it does always come back to being voluntary. And so you may end up going that way with your conversation quite a bit. Start, reading it this way. Well, no, let's bring it back. What does socialism mean? What does voluntary mean?
Yep. Now there's another verse. I'm sure you're more familiar with this one than me. It has to do with Jesus driving out the money changers. Many may be familiar with that in general. Just when I guess there are people out in front of the church selling. I forget what they were selling. Maybe you know more about that. That was in Matthew 21 verses 12 to 13. And Jesus drove them away. So obviously this must mean Jesus was driving away the capitalists, but I don't think that was the point. I think the point is, you're doing this in an area where people are attending to, I think the meaning of church is actually, it's supposed to represent a body of people that come together for the purpose of worship. It's not so much about a big building with a big cross on top of it. It's more about people getting together and doing that, worshiping. So how do you tackle that one, that Jesus was just kicking out some capitalists?
Right. It definitely wasn't capitalist. The temple that it's referring to, it's a big deal. And it's something that we don't really have today because the temple, which is where God rested prior to the temple being destroyed. And then it's, written about in throughout the New Testament of now the Holy Spirit and the temple was very, very important. In the Old Testament, again, a shadow of what God would later do with us. And in this temple, this is why Jesus is so upset that it's not just a random church. This is the house of the Lord. It's very important. It's his Father's house, he says. And these men aren't just capitalists, but they're making a mockery of the laws and of the temple that is God's temple.
Yeah, the way Reed describes it here, it's you're using it for a totally different purpose. You're defiling it.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's important. I think sometimes when we kind of boil this down to just some sort of a political discussion, we lose some of the spiritual aspects that are extremely important. Our faith, it touches on a lot of political themes here, but most importantly, there are spiritual aspects that are extremely important when we're talking about Christ as the Messiah or God's law. Absolutely.
Well, all right, here's a really good one. So you often hear the verse misquoted. Some people think it says money is the root of all evil. That is not what it says. So that's referring to 1 Timothy 6:10. Here's what Paul actually said. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. So that, just right there, just the wording of that, it's much different than people take it out of context over and over and over again and misquote it over and over and over. It's the love of money, which is totally different than saying money itself is the root of all evil.
Right. And so if money itself was the root of all evil, then we need to give up all money, live in, a communal living where we just maybe exchange, fruits and vegetables. That's how the conversation goes, at least in my experience. And but yes, you're absolutely right. It's the love of money, and it's funny how that one word can alter the discussion and the meaning of that. So,
and it doesn't even say evil itself; it says all kinds of evil. So the love of money could lead to evil in many different senses.
Yes, absolutely. And we could go on all day about what people have done, because of their love of money, because of their greed.
And maybe the idea there is that, it's not that you can't go after money and chase money and, try to make your life better and your family life better. But once you put money in front of God and once you value money more than God, that's where you're going way off course.
Right, absolutely. And the Bible says you can't serve two masters. And
Yeah.
I do think it's important that when we look at money, we aren't just looking at this kind of this Lord of the ring where you touch this money and it makes you just lust after all these evil things. But when we start talking in a more realistic setting where it's just a medium of exchange, I think that we can have a more fruitful conversation about that verse and what it means and how exactly do we go forward with that information.
Yeah, maybe we can go off course here a little bit. I was having a discussion with somebody the other day. Well, actually, in the Tom Woods Elite group, we were having a big discussion about this. Should billionaires exist? And I was arguing, yeah, of course they should exist. I mean, for someone to be a billionaire, that means they must have helped millions of people. Like take Jeff Bezos, for example. He's supposedly worth $145 billion. And I was trying to explain that, it's not like he has $145 billion under his mattress. Amazon's business model is to reinvest. So every time he's reinvesting, he's really reinvesting in people. He's lowering the prices of our consumer prices on Amazon. I love Amazon. He's hiring more people. He's improving the lives of people. So how do you tackle that question? Should there be billionaires, or does this go back to the thing we were saying earlier about not coveting people? Why would it matter how much someone has?
I think that that's a point of the conversation that you have to tackle these moral objections to money, and these moral objections to capitalism versus socialism, because like we've already discussed, socialism just has this appeal where you're taking care of people, and capitalism has this bad
exploiting people. Yeah,
you're exploiting people, right? So I think it's all from a moral, argument. And so I think once you get past that, then having those conversations where you're explaining the, economics and the way that, anarcho-capitalism is very beneficial for other people, and the way that, investing of money and voluntary association, the way that all of that can be more profitable for people. And, that's really where your conversation is going to go. But I think that you're going to take a little while to get there, dealing with the moral aspects and redefining or properly defining socialism and things like that.
Exactly. That's how I always thought about it. So let's see here. I did save the best for last. So that's Romans 13, 1-7. And I have it pulled up here. And I'm actually just going to go ahead and read that one verse because we can discuss the first part of it, but I think the following part of it is what really puts it all into perspective. Now, the people who are arguing this point against us are only going to quote this first part. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of one who is an authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. Now it goes on a little bit there, but it basically just repeats the same thing. So that's one aspect of it. So maybe we can just touch on that before I read the next part. Because basically the idea is that, if Hitler was in power above you, like you have to accept them. You have to subject yourself to Hitler. And obviously that doesn't seem quite right, just logically, but how would you tackle that off the bat?
It actually is hard, or it's not hard, but it's complicated. Finding out where the person who's using Romans 13, kind of finding out from their perspective, because there's a lot of different angles to it. But what I usually do, no matter who I'm talking to, point out that Romans 13 as a chapter break in the book. It's actually one long letter from Paul to the Romans, and when you look at the end of chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13, we're looking at, I think, somewhere around 28 verses where when read all together, it shows the actions of a Christian, the way that a Christian should act. And in most cases, how they're acting when in conflict to something else. Don't repay evil for evil. And the portion, the first 7 verses of chapter 13 is what you've read out there. And that's no different. That is the way that a Christian should act while under government. And it's interesting that it's in conflict with the descriptions of the way that a Christian should act, just a few verses before and after.
Yeah, and I've actually read multiple really good responses to this. I think the one that sounded the most convincing to me is the idea that, look, even if you're living under Hitler, the point is, don't stoop to Hitler's level and initiate violence against him. Like, subject yourself, if you want to call it that, subject yourself. But at the same time, God, everybody has their reckoning with God one day. And Hitler will have his, and we'll have ours, and we'll have to fess up to all the things we've done. But the thing is, not to stoop to Hitler's level and, initiate violence against them. But here's the next part. So it goes on into verse 8, and it says this: "Owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves one another has fulfilled the law." That definitely puts things into context. It's not saying that you have to enjoy living under Hitler or any despotic ruler. It's saying it's saying exactly the opposite, that you reject them, obviously, but you wouldn't go out of your way to, start another Holocaust to get back at Hitler, whatever it may be.
Yeah, absolutely. We see over and again that, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So that's why Paul spends so much time here in a few other places, how a Christian should be, and that isn't to use violence. We see it over and again about everything from turning the other cheek to, if you're robbed, give. I'm terrible at recall, but I mean, if someone tries to steal your jacket, give them your shirt as well. These are the marks of a Christian, and it's definitely in conflict with what it says that the state can do or will do. And
it's funny you mentioned that. My mom used to love Creflo Dollar. She probably still does. I used to always listen to that guy growing up. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, I'm familiar.
Okay, he's a real eccentric guy. He's a great guy, but that was one thing he said, because he said one time I caught someone stealing out of my wallet, and what I did was I doubled the amount that they were stealing, and the person looked at him and was just like, "What? I was stealing from you. How are you going to double it?" And that's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, but I think I got it. Where, yes, I with Creflo Dollar, I'm not a fan of his preaching at all, but I mean he's right in that sense that as Christians we do understand that there is theft, there is private property, but we're also not supposed to use violence against other people, and a lot of times blessing your enemy, it says, is what we should do.
Yeah, and to be fair, I should have worded that better. When I say Creflo Dollar's a great guy, I mostly meant that one point at least. But there's a good discussion to be had whether these guys like Creflo Dollar, Pat Robertson, I forget, is that the guy's name? These like mega pastors, do they live a godly life in reality, or do they not?
Right. And I can point to, examples in their teaching that I disagree with. And, sometimes a broken clock is right twice a day, right, when it comes to certain issues.
Definitely. Well, I think we've covered most of the main aspects there. I hope that helps a lot of the viewers out. Surely there's a lot more topics we can hit on. I think one last aspect I want to talk about, it's the idea of usury. Now, you posted a question about this one time in the group. I don't know if it was a question or just kind of saying how you felt. It's a big debate among Christians, because usury, for people who don't know, it traditionally meant charging interest of any kind. So say like I loaned you $100. I can only expect back $100. I can't really charge you interest and have it be within the confines of God's law. Now, usury in the modern sense pretty much means kind of like what a loan shark does. They charge you like a 200% interest, and they break your legs if you don't pay it back. What is your perspective on that? And because I got in a big debate with people on that thread, I was arguing with these two people, and I'm sure you saw it. I mean, it was pretty obvious, but I was basically arguing that no, I mean, usury, it's just or charging interest to people, it's just something you do in the free market, because there's a difference between low time preference and high time preference. Because otherwise, if that was strictly banned in the most purest sense, then I couldn't loan someone some money who agrees to pay me back more with interest. So how do you feel about that?
So, I mean, again, with voluntary, interactions, people don't have to charge an interest. But as you and I know, there is use for that in economics. Usury, as far as I'm aware, is only for, like you said, the loan sharks and the 200% interest and things like that. And that again is where we should be as Christians, not charging those outrageous interest rates. So I don't think that it's interest, period. It's those extremely high interest rates, and that's something, again, that it just comes down to the individual. It's not something that really a state can say, well, this is too high and this is too low. That's regulated by the market. And usury, like so many things in the Bible, it's a heart motive, right? So again, it's not interest just for the sake of interest. It's that extremely high interest that's potentially harmful to the person that you're lending to. And as a Christian, we should think about that.
Right. I mean, I guess in the context of the Bible, I mean, they were living in abject poverty. I mean, they lived with very little. They probably at that time couldn't have imagined what life could have been like today. I mean, this was 2,000 plus years ago. It was totally impossible to imagine that we could have acquired the wealth we had today and built up the wealth we had today. So yeah, I guess it's all just about putting things in the context. Hey, this has been a lot of fun. I been waiting to do this episode for a while. Now, I will mention that I noticed your mic cut out a few times there. I don't know if it was the internet problem. So I don't know if I go back and watch the video. I'll try to edit some stuff out the best I can. But okay. No, you're fine. You're fine. I hope this helped everybody. So let's see here. I'm going to link to, like I said, I'm going to link to my Amazon wish list. I'm going to link to that fee page where it's going to show the Jesus Was a Socialist PDF for the rendering on the Caesar. Going to link to anarchochristian.com. Going to link to the Facebook Anarcho-Christian page. Going to link to the Anarcho-Christian group. I'm going to link to our last episode. I was on your podcast, actually, for Anarcho-Christian podcast, episode 15. Going to link to that. And you actually did another episode on your own. I think it was episode 20 for the Anarcho-Christian podcast. Is there anything else I can link to?
The website is great. On the website, you'll find the links to, YouTube and iTunes or wherever it is that you catch your podcasts and things like that. And again, come into the group as well on Facebook. We have a great group that's, very a wide variety of people of knowledge of the Bible and of economics and things like that. And we have a lot of great conversation.
Well, absolutely. There have been many times where I've been objectively confused about certain things, and I come in with a question. People are very, very kind to me, like Christians should be to each other, and I come away with a much better perspective on things. So, Stephen, thank you so much. God bless you, and we'll talk again soon.
Hey, thanks for having me.